We often talk about tax reforms and tax policy proposals as things that will affect us right now in the present, or things that will not affect us right now in the present. But we rarely stop and think how those policies will affect our descendants, our children, our grandchildren, and potentially, as we live longer, our great-grandchildren have to be considered. Now, in today's video in particular, I want to talk about Kamala Harris's tax proposals, some specific things she said, and how those things might particularly affect maybe not you, but will surely affect your descendants down the line if they ever become law. That's the topic of today's video. Hello everyone, my name is Javier Correa. I'm a Research and Development Associate here at Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs go where they're treated best, minimize their taxes, create offshore business structures, and improve their lifestyles and quality of life overall. Now today I wanted to make this video to talk about how Kamala Harris's tax policies could impact your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren if you're not careful. And this is a topic that is often overlooked. When politicians talk about a tax proposal, they often say, well, this is going to go after the very, very rich, and therefore it doesn't affect the majority of, in this case, Americans, or the majority of Venezuelans, in the case of Venezuela, the majority of Frenchmen, in the case of the French. And so, for example, Kamala Harris has recently talked about taxing unrealized capital gains, which is something that is truly unprecedented in American history. In fact, I mentioned in my other video where I talk about Kamala Harris's major tax proposals and how they would impact entrepreneurs and investors. I mentioned that I do firmly believe that if that were to be approved by Congress, because you do have to keep in mind all tax proposals that are essentially proposed, as the name indicates, by presidents have to go through Congress, and they have to be approved by both houses of Congress, U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, before they become law, right? But if any of these proposals were to become law, in particular the one about taxing unrealized capital gains, would very likely have to end up in the Supreme Court, where the justices, the 9 justices, would have to assess whether that is actually a constitutional measure that can actually be taken, the fact of, taxing unrealized capital gains. But anyway, I want to talk about how that policy in particular might affect your children, your great-grandchildren, and your grandchildren. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is I was recently going through some U.S. tax history as I was researching things for Nomad Capitalist and for different clients, and I was looking into the history of the U.S. income tax, and I noticed that when the income tax we know of today was introduced back in 1913, so a little over 110 years ago, the income tax was meant to target the wealthiest Americans in the U.S. It was essentially meant to target the Rockefellers, the JP Morgans, the Vanderbilts. And, if you take a look at the value, the minimum income threshold you had to basically earn in the United States to be taxable from an income tax perspective, it would be the equivalent of a very high income today. And so what does history teach us? It teaches us that politicians always start by going after the very wealthy. In this case, Kamala Harris is talking about taxing the unrealized capital gains of those with a net worth of around $100 million or more, which obviously will not include most people watching this video. It includes a very small percentage of Americans. But just as the income tax started out targeting more affluent Americans and then trickled down and, through the slippery slope effect, went down to tax almost every American in the world, I believe that this unrealized capital gains tax, if approved, could potentially end up targeting Americans that are not as wealthy over the years. So we're starting off at $100 million right now if this is approved by Congress, Kamala Harris's current proposal. But what happens if after Kamala Harris we get Elizabeth Warren? And Elizabeth Warren comes in and says, you know what, $100 million is too much. Let's do $75 million. And then we have Elizabeth Warren's second term, and she says, well, 75 million isn't enough. Let's do 50 million. And then Bernie Sanders comes in and says, you know what, maybe it should be 10 million. And then, if you keep pushing that effect, over the years, you might end up with a reality where they say, you know what, anyone whose net worth is $1 million or more has to pay unrealized capital gains tax. And that honestly frightens me as an investor. It frightens me as an entrepreneur. It frightens me as an attorney. I think that is a very aggressive form of taxation. And I think that nothing would stop left-leaning politicians from becoming ever more abusive in their quest for higher taxation, in their quest for punishing the wealthy, for punishing entrepreneurs, for punishing investors and innovators. And I think that we've seen that this has happened in places already like the United States, where again, the income tax wasn't meant to target the average American. It was meant to target more affluent Americans, maybe not necessarily just billionaires, maybe some, high income earning lawyers, doctors, whatever would have been affected by this back in 1913 as well. But the general idea was, if you're wealthy, you can contribute a bit more to the economy. I'm sure you've heard that one before. And that's why we're going to introduce an income tax. And now the income tax became mainstream, or has become mainstream. And therefore, many Americans just pay their income taxes, no questions asked. And they think it's something very normal. But you know what? 100 years ago, the income tax wasn't that normal. Income taxes were rare. It was something weird. It was something recently introduced. It was novel in many ways. And it is just over the decades that the income tax has become part of the regular culture of everyday Americans. And people have forgotten that at the beginning, they were talking about taxing the evil rich. They were talking about going after the people who made more money and the people who were better off, who could contribute more to the economy. Now, I would agree the rhetoric back then was maybe a bit less aggressive than the rhetoric we see now, but the core argument, the core objective was essentially the same. So let's assume that Kamala Harris gets in now and she gets her $100 million threshold passed for the unrealized capital gains. Sure, you might not be affected right now if you have a net worth. Let's say you're very well off, but you're not at that, $100 million level. Let's say you have $40 million in net worth and assets and whatever it may be. So maybe you won't be affected, but think about what will happen to your kids, your grandkids, or your great-grandkids. What do I always say, and what do we always say here at Nomad Capitalist? The important thing is you have options. What is the difference between 1913 and 2024 or 2025? In 1913, it was very difficult to have location-independent income. In 1913, if you were well off, if you had your law practice, you had your law firm, you had your doctor's office, if you had any type of business, 99.9% of all businesses were very much location dependent. You needed an office, you needed a factory, you needed a warehouse to operate. Now, surely that is still the case for many businesses, but we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the possibility of maybe having an on-the-ground business in the US, but having a management company in another country, right? We didn't have the possibility of maybe having a completely location-independent business if we're software developers or consultants, or if we're overall in the service industry. We didn't have the option of living in Latin America and having clients in the US, Canada, or Europe, and being able to talk to them in real time. In 1913, we didn't have the option to potentially have so many citizenships as we do now. Having dual citizenship, having multiple passports was extremely rare. In fact, there are still certain countries to date that are very restrictive on their citizens having multiple passports. And those policies usually date back to the early 20th century, in some cases to the 19th century. So 2025, 2024 is an exciting place and moment to live in human history, because for the first time in, I believe, ever, we can truly create wealth regardless of where we are. Our location no longer dictates the level of wealth that we can create and how successful we can be. In many cases, and it's surely my case, and it's surely the case of many people watching this video, my ancestors, your ancestors, my grandparents, your great-grandparents, my great-grandparents crossed oceans to go where they were treated best. They got on a boat. They abandoned everything they knew in the old country. In my case, it was Spain. In cases like my colleague, Dr. Maria, it was Italy. In cases like the ones that are surely watching this video, it could be Ireland, it could be Germany. And our ancestors left everything behind to go to one place where they were treated best. Well, now we can honor their memory and we can protect our descendants by having our money go where it's treated best, having our businesses go where they're treated best, and then having ourselves go where we are treated best. And those places can, for the first time in human history, be completely different. Now, granted, some of you will say, well, sure, you could open a Swiss bank account back in the 1930s and still live in the US. Sure, of course you could, but you get what my point is. You get what I mean. It has never been as easy as it is today. It has never been as natural as it is today. And hey, maybe in 50 years' time, we'll see our grandchildren saying goodbye in the spaceport as they take off for the interstellar journey to settle a Martian colony with Elon Musk and create new business opportunities on Mars. Maybe that's the future. But for the time being, and to ensure that your grandkids and your great-grandkids have the possibility of potentially getting on that spaceship and heading off to Mars or wherever it is that they're going to be, we have to make sure that we are where we're treated best. So, to protect yourself from all these tax policies and to be sure that you're following the latest information, the latest trends, nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next video.